Welcome.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you for hearing this bill, firstly, and giving space to this conversation, which I find really necessary and extremely pressing in the communities that I personally work with. I have a monumental and somewhat unexpected task tonight. I had a number of folks prepared to testify from their direct experience engaging with the court fine system and the judiciary who had to leave either for family commitments or for the hours a day. So my task now, somewhat unexpectedly, is to try to remind us that amid the statistics and the numbers and the dollar figures, we are talking about human beings and human lives that impact families and communities and our state as a whole. I work at an organization called the Nonviolence Institute in Providence, which is geared toward violence reduction. We operate largely through direct service, working specifically with young folks aged 12 to 24 who are most at risk for being shot, shooting someone, or going to prison for a violent crime. We're dedicated to working with those members of our community most directly impacted by violence. All of our work is geared toward building what Dr. Martin Luther King referred to as the beloved community, where everyone is welcome and no one is excluded. We provide street worker outreach. We provide nonviolence training, prisoner reentry, employment readiness. We outreach the families of every homicide victim across the state within 24 hours, which is actually the position that I started as a victim advocate. I've seen firsthand the damage that violence does to our communities through hospital visits. I've held mothers as they received the news that their son did not survive his gunshot wound. I've gone and sat on couches 7 months later when that same mother wondered when that pain was going to subside. I've been there in the courtroom a year later when they watch the person accused of killing their son go on trial. And I've been with them side by side when they realize that that system hasn't lessened their pain. I've come to understand that that is a pain that does not subside. That is the nature of violence. But if we're talking about building a beloved community, if we're talking about what Dr. King really meant, then we're not just talking about violence as bullets and fists. We're talking about a responsibility to comfort the sick, to protect the weak, to give voice to the voiceless, and in the case of this bill, to relentlessly champion the poor. Nick earlier talked about the first bill he ever worked on, which inspired me to speak briefly about the first bill I ever worked on, which was commonly called the Unshackling Pregnant Prisoners Bill. It was the Healthy Pregnancies for Incarcerated Women Act. I was a 19-year-old community organizer. It was the first piece of legislation I ever worked on, and it aimed to prevent inmates who were pregnant from being shackled. Before that, they could have legally been shackled at the wrists, at the ankles, at the waists. This bill and subsequently that law prevented that. We had a young woman come up and testify on that bill who was pregnant she was in the third trimester of her pregnancy when she was incarcerated. She had to hop up on a milk crate to get into the van to go on a medical visit. She was shackled at the time. She tripped. There was no seatbelt in the van. She bounced around the whole time. And anyone who has children knows how horrifying a reality that can be. To me, the most awful part of that story wasn't just the immediate experience. It was that she spent that weekend in prison because she had failed to pay her court fines. When we are talking about this bill, we are not just talking about the experience of the judiciary or the process of being in the courtroom. We're talking about actual lives. We're talking about human beings who impact their families and their communities. One woman who was set to speak with you this evening, I'll try my best to capture some of her voice. She is an incredible colleague of mine. She is our deputy senior street worker. She oversees the team of outreach workers who are working hand in hand with the young folks who are at risk. The first thing she said when she sat down with me to talk about this bill, she said, "Well, I've been paying court fines since I was 18 years old, and she is my senior." She said the biggest stress of that process was never knowing if I was going to slip up and lose everything, go right back to prison. At one point, she was telling me about not having a job, and she didn't know if she could afford to pay rent, let alone her court fines. But suddenly, not having a job, not being able to afford her rent, came hand in hand with what could potentially be criminal implications. She described being hungry. She described borrowing $50 from her church and having to make the decision of, do I eat or do I pay these court fines? In her words, she said she would rather pay the light bill, and if they catch me, I'll do the time, because at least I'll know I was able to pay the rent or pay the heating bill for my kids, so they'll be warm while I'm locked up. That choice is a fundamentally violent one. If we're defining violence, if we're talking about building the actual beloved community, if we're talking about walking in that sense, then that choice is an act of violence. Asking any community member to make that choice is an act of violence to which we are all accomplices. She said, in her words better than I can ever say, that not having a job and being poor means I might go to prison for something I simply can't afford. This bill is a simple ask. It is asking that we do not criminalize people for their inability to pay court fines. As Nick mentioned, we're not talking about restitution, we're talking about court fines, we're talking about user fees, we're talking about the revenue that keeps the court system going, which in this case is built on the backs of those who are most vulnerable in our communities. Those who stand the greatest chance to reform themselves, rehabilitate. Ms. Black's paper, and in everyone's packets you'll find the judicial memo for it. It found that the majority of folks who were locked up in these circumstances made an attempt to pay. They had a history of debt compliance. They attempted to make the payment, but in the majority of cases, something happened where they were unable to do so. 3/4, as she mentioned, of those arrested debtors were misdemeanor offenders, a third of which were originally arrested for driving on a suspended license. Now, to the judiciary's credit, some of those provisions within the 2008 bill have been effectively implemented. The reduced jail time provision within that law has been implemented, has been enacted. But what remains troubling is that a third of those arrested debtors in 2015 were incarcerated after seeing a judge of court. There's a need for the law to state clearly and directly that our courts must meaningfully assess a defendant's ability to pay in a standardized, comprehensive, and good faith way. The tools are there, but the responsibility is ours. Thank you very much for your time. I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Jordan. Any questions?